Okay, welcome back, guys. So, as we get into this topic of eating disorders and eating disorder diagnoses, I want to run through the different diagnoses that people can actually get in the clinical system. Now, we are going to focus primarily on anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. I may talk a little bit again about binge eating disorder, but we did talk a lot about that when we talked about food addiction. So I really want to focus on anorexia and bulimia because we are going to be relating those particular disorders to secondary exercise addiction next class. But I do want you to be familiar with all the categories of eating disorders, even one category that we're not really going to talk about because it's not related to exercise addiction per se, but it is a form of eating disorder, otherwise specified. So I want you guys to just know what that is as part of this whole unit. So here we go. The different categories of eating disorders that individuals can be diagnosed with. So we have, disordered eating patterns can either be subclinical or rise to the level of diagnosis, as I said. Subclinical basically means that people exhibit some of the characteristics of a particular diagnosis, but not all of the required criteria. That doesn't mean that the pattern itself does not need some form of clinical intervention or that the pattern itself couldn't lead to health problems. Having said that, disordered eating patterns can become so extreme, they rise to the level of diagnosis of one of four eating disorders. One of four. Okay, stay with me on this one. We've got anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, which are two more common forms of eating disorder, and those are the ones that are most strongly related to secondary exercise addiction that we'll talk about next class. Binge eating disorder, you know a fair amount about now, but I will talk a little bit about it just to get your head back into the criteria. And I didn't talk about all the criteria, so we will talk about that as well. That's related to food addiction that we talked about in a previous class. And then a fourth category known as otherwise specified feeding and eating disorders. There's an acronym, OSFED. OSFED. That's a good way to remember it, OSFED. Pica, rumination disorder, purging disorder, and night eating syndrome, which is an interesting one. So I do want you to know what these are, even though these are not as strongly related to secondary exercise addiction. And some subtypes may be more so than others. So pica has to do with ingesting non-nutritive food, meaning things that are not needed for our nutritional value and for our bodies to function properly. This typically happens when an individual routinely consumes items that are not even food, such as chalk, dirt, or paper. You may or may not have heard of this before, but this is an actual disorder known as pica. Oftentimes, people do this intentionally as a way of preventing themselves from having an appetite or controlling their appetite. Rumination disorder. Now, I've talked about the meaning of ruminative many times in this class for a variety of reasons. Ruminative, remember what that means. When you ruminate, you have the same thought again and again and again and again. It's an obsessive thought pattern that remains in your consciousness. It makes it difficult to concentrate on anything else and will often cause anxiety. So, rumination disorder with regard to eating involves individuals who repeatedly will regurgitate and then rechew their food. Then they will either spit it out or more frequently, they will actually re-swallow the food. So in this case, the rumination is not a thought pattern like we're accustomed to in this class, but an actual behavior of repeating the same activity. Purging disorder. Now, when we talk about bulimia, we're going to talk about the purge cycle, the binge purge cycle. This is a little bit different because in purging disorder, there is no binging behavior. Now, you know what binging is because when I talked about food addiction and I talked about binge eating disorder, I talked about the fact that binging involves ingesting extremely large amounts of calories. It could be anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 in one sitting. And typically these foods are very high fat, high sugar. And then people try to get rid of that with some purging activity. In this case, purging disorder, there is no binging behavior. With this disorder, the individual consumes the food in a normal rate with a normal amount of calories, but then purges the food, meaning gets rid of it in some way to try to control their weight and or their body shape. And then finally, we have something called night eating syndrome. Now, I mean, many of us say, oh, at night I get the munchies or whatever. That's not quite what we're talking about here. Night eating syndrome is diagnosed when an individual eats excessively in the evening hours, or wakes up in the middle of the night and eats. Importantly, the individual has awareness of doing this and remembers the events. It's not sleepwalking, where people are sleepwalking and undergoing patterns of repetitive automatic activity where people open refrigerators and make a sandwich. That's interesting stuff, but that's not what this is. In night eating disorder, people are very aware consciously that they're eating in the nighttime or they're getting up in the middle of the night and eating. Okay, so I wanted to mention those to you so you have like a full sense of the different kinds of eating disorders that get diagnosed. But when we talk about secondary exercise addiction next time, we're going to focus more on some of these than others, but it's good to understand eating disorders in general because these are important for understanding our health status. Okay, so on the next slide, I want to start with anorexia. We're going to start talking about anorexia, and then we're going to talk about some of the other disorders as well. I'll meet you on the next slide.